Sure. All right. Audio. Good evening. Welcome. We will begin the conversation here in just a few moments. We're waiting for others to log in and join us by phone. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that while we're waiting for others, in addition to answering your questions tonight, those of you on the webinar can respond to questions that our digital team will be asking of you. There'll be 3 questions throughout the course of the evening, and webinar respondents will have 30 seconds each to respond to those questions. If you're joining us by phone, we want to hear from you too. Please email us at causnet@commoncause.org. That's causnet, C-A-U-S-E-N-E-T, @commoncause.org. With that, Karen, it looks like most people are online or have dialed in, so let's get started.
Great. So first, good evening to all of you who have joined us. We're very excited to have you join us tonight and join this Common Cause member call. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Karen Hobert-Flynn, and as of a week and a half ago, I am the new president of Common Cause. So we're going to talk tonight about the leadership change at Common Cause and the future of our work with our 475,000 members and activists, with our 35 state chapters, state leaders, and state staff that work on our democracy platform across the states and at the local level as well. And as we are pushing forward reforms that take on power and lift the voices of average people in our democracy. But first, I'm assisted this evening by 2 of my colleagues. First is Scott Swenson, who is Vice President of Communications, and he'll be helping out by getting your questions and organizing them so that we can address as many of them as we can in this short time we have together. And second is Izzy Bronstein, who is our digital campaigner, and I'm going to ask her to explain to you how you can engage with our call this evening and also what to do if you're having technical issues. So Izzy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Karen. So like Karen said, and Scott mentioned earlier, if you have any questions for us during this call, please send them to causnet@commoncause.org. Once again, that's causnet, C-A-U-S-E-N-E-T, @commoncause.org. And we'll be trying to get to as many of them as possible. And as well, if you have any technical difficulties, if you can't get into the webinar, if you're having trouble on the phone, please send all of those questions and concerns just to causnet@commoncause.org.
Great. So while many of you have been members of Common Cause and supporters for years, we have some of the most loyal members and activists ever, and have many activists that joined us in 1970 when we were first founded and stay with us. But we're also excited to say that we have engaged and brought in many new supporters and activists over a very short period of time. Because many people, as we do, care and understand that democracy hangs in the balance. And it's really important that we are engaging and fighting back to ensure that everyone can participate in our democracy. And we need to reclaim our democracy from special interest influence. So many of you know Common Cause was founded in 1970 by John Gardner, who talked about everyone is organized by the people, and he took out an ad in the New York Times, and people responded and joined Common Cause. And since then, we have worked on a wide range of democracy issues, from transparency to money in politics and other issues. But there are sort of 5 main areas or core areas of our work that I thought I'd just briefly outline. One of the highest priorities for us is working on money and politics issues. That's issues from transparency and contribution limits, small donor public financing, and address the problems that have come about as a result of the Citizens United decision. We also work on voting rights and voting reforms. And this is going to be, as many of you probably know, the first election in 50 years without the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And so we need to be working both to push back on voter suppression laws, but also paving a path forward to break down barriers so that people can participate in our elections. And Common Cause has done tremendous work in this area. We also work on issues around districting and have looked at districting reform. So many of you know that politicians like to rig the system and carve out districts for themselves, so they're selecting voters so that they can ensure they have safe districts, and then marginalizing and moving other voters and packing them into other districts to minimize their impact and voice in politics. So we work on a wide range of reforms in the redistricting area, from litigation to drawing maps that courts often use, to creating an independent citizens redistricting commission in places like Arizona and in particular California, where we moved that in the last few years, and it's been very successful. We also work on media and democracy reform, because we see that the media has tremendous power to influence our political discourse, and free and open discourse is very essential to a healthy democracy. So we work on issues that include a free and open and accessible internet, and slow media consolidation, and work to ensure transparency. We've had some recent wins in the area with the FCC in the area of net neutrality or open internet. And just last week, a court upheld the net neutrality rules that the FCC had passed not long ago. We also believe in that our concentrated wealth and its ability to purchase political power and influence is a real threat to our democracy. So Common Cause is exploring ways to engage in income inequality issues and racial equity issues in ways that connect with their democracy lens. So a good example of that is some work that our Michigan chapter has done around the Flint water crisis, which I'm sure you've heard about. But at its core, it's a failure of democracy, where the governor and corporations and others ignored the cries of people in Flint when they talked about their water being poisoned. There was an emergency manager law in place that basically took away the power of the local Flint City Council. And so not only did they have no power to help the people of Flint, but also there was no accountability, no transparency. The citizens had no right to bring, any kind of complaints to Flint City Council. So we have been working on freedom of information reform, where the governor and the legislature were exempt from those transparency laws, and also and talking about and working to reform the strict draconian emergency manager law in Michigan. So we'll talk about these issues, more of these issues a little bit later, and take your questions about the things that we're working on. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about our transition. Some of you may know our most recent president, Miles Rappaport, who is leaving Common Cause after 2.5 years of doing terrific work to really focus on connecting real people to the issues that we work on. Miles Rappaport and I have been good friends for 20 years, and I worked with him at the state level when he was Secretary of State in Connecticut, and he has also worked as an activist with many organizations. He was Secretary of State and an elected official in the House in the General Assembly in Connecticut for over a decade. He was committee chair of a committee that had jurisdiction over elections and money in politics and ethics laws. And he's also led several organizations, Connecticut Citizen Action Group, Demos, which is a think tank in New York, where he led that for 13 years, and then came to Common Cause for a couple of years. He is going to serve as a senior advisor for the next few months to help with transition issues and help Common Cause in any way that he can, which we're very appreciative. He is a good friend, incredibly empathetic, and very passionate about connecting and working on democracy issues, economic issues, and social justice issues. So we're grateful for his help. For those of you who don't know me, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working in the public interest space for 32 years. I started with Common Cause back in 1985. At Common Cause at the national level, I did a couple of different things. One was I worked to do grassroots organizing with our volunteers and activists. At the time, we had 65 volunteers that would come in and volunteer several times a week. They would do phone banking, network and talk to our activists, and engage in both federal and state issues. It was a great job, and some of the volunteers that I worked with back in 1985 are still here volunteering with us each week today. And in some ways, they think I'm their kid that grew up and made good. I also worked on campaign finance studies and did that for several years. In my later work, I stopped talking about the fact that I did campaign finance studies because I didn't want to just do campaign finance studies. I've also worked at the state level, and I worked for more than a decade in Connecticut, as I mentioned earlier, as the executive director there, where I was able to help move a number of ethics, campaign finance, and other laws that, you know, I worked on them for a long period of time with a broad coalition. But when a corruption scandal struck involving our governor, it gave us an opportunity to move really transformative reform in terms of a sweeping campaign finance bill that included small donor public financing for statewide races as well as legislative races. That system is still going strong. We've had to do a lot of work and oversight to implement it well, but I'm very proud of that accomplishment. Back in 2007, our president, Bob Edgar, asked me to join the national staff once again to lead our efforts to work with all our state offices. We have tremendous state volunteer chapters and staff chapters with extraordinary leaders that move really important reforms in our democracy, and I love doing that work. I later became senior vice president and worked with both our national and state programs, and I've loved that work. When our president, Bob Edgar, suddenly died, I served as interim president at that time, and then continued to do work with Miles Rappaport when he came on board. I've also worked for some other nonprofits in between there, but that's just to give you a little bit of sense of some of the work that I've done. Lastly, I would say that I think there is no time more important in our history than now in terms of the issues that are affecting our democracy. With the Citizens United decision that unleashed a torrent of special interest money that is unprecedented in our political system, when you see the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby that stripped some essential protections in the Voting Rights Act, and restrictive measures that have swept the country, that are blocking participation in our democracy, we have found that more and more people understand the huge challenges our democracy faces. And from one perspective, it's exciting to see people talking about them, and that we are seeing the new American majority, younger people, who are less ideological, but care deeply about these issues and want to figure out ways to engage. And they have been engaging and working with Common Cause on these issues, which I think is very important. And we, as Common Cause, I believe, need to be looking for ways to engage people on the platforms where they are, so that we are doing more online, moving into engaging on mobile platforms, and that we are communicating people and connecting the issues in our democracy with the things that they care about in their real lives. And also working broadly with coalitions, because we know if we don't broaden the movement for democracy reform, we simply cannot win these fights. The other thing I would say about Common Cause is we have such value as a nonpartisan organization that will work across the aisle with Democrats and Republicans, and also that we can engage at the national level, the state level, or the local level, looking for strategic openings to move important reforms wherever they crop up. So we can be nimble with our state and national structure to focus resources where the biggest fights are. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can open this up for some questions, both questions that you can post as we're going along, and also some that have been put in place and sent in earlier.
So, Karen, we have our first question from Dave in Baltimore asking, how can the enthusiasm for Senator Bernie Sanders campaign build support for Common Cause?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking it, Dave. So first, one of the things we've been very pleased to see Bernie Sanders talking so much about democracy issues and money in politics. He has used that issue to galvanize millions of people who are very excited about his candidacy. Just a reminder, Common Cause is nonpartisan. We don't endorse any candidates, and we've been pleased to see many other candidates, Hillary Clinton, and also candidates on the Republican side talking about the need for transparency and disclosure. So we've seen a lot more talking about our issues. The truth is, Bernie talks about our issues the way we do. I don't think it's, I think that you can go online, you can look at polling and see that these are issues that are incredibly compelling for Democrats, independents, and Republicans. But one of the challenges with what Bernie does is that he mainly talks about the problem. And in our polling and messaging work, much of which Scott has led, shows us that when you just talk about the problem, you run into a barrier of cynicism that nothing can be done that can make any kind of difference. And so the challenge for us is to really be focusing on, what the solutions are and how the solutions make a real difference with some of these problems. And so we are going to be working on, over the coming months, our Fight Big Money agenda. And the Fight Big Money agenda is something that we work with a coalition of groups to try and push presidential candidates, and now we're going to move it to congressional candidates, to talk about the key solutions that we need to see in money in politics. So it's built around that everyone participates. So looking at small donor public financing systems, everyone's voice is heard, and so that we have equal access to the ballot box, as well as people have a right to not have their voices drowned out by special interest money. We also talk about everyone needs to know who's trying to influence our politics and our elections. So talking about strong disclosure. Everyone plays by fair common sense rules. And for that, we're talking about ways to address the Citizens United decision and overturning it, whether we do it by a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, whether it is calling on the Senate to do their job to confirm a nominee to replace or take Scalia's seat on the Supreme Court, or whether it's working on long-term First Amendment jurisprudence on money in politics. That is a critical piece. And then the final piece is that everyone's held accountable, and so that we have to make sure that any campaign finance laws we pass are enforceable, and that we have an enforcement agency that has teeth and really can enforce these laws. So that's talking about completely restructuring the FEC, but also having the IRS create clear, bright lines and guidelines for what constitutes political activity. So part of the challenge in our Fight Big Money agenda is to push candidates to talk about solutions, and not only solutions, but what they personally will do to ensure that we see solutions moving forward. So for presidential candidates, how are they going to prioritize this? Are they talking about it on the campaign trail? Are they going to lay out in their first 100 days what they're going to do to try and move reform? For congressional candidates, have them talk about what they're willing to do and what kind of leadership they'll show to move this agenda forward. So we will be asking activists to talk to congressional candidates, to follow up on the questionnaire we sent out on Fight Big Money. We have had activists email and tweet candidates over the summer and July 4th, tracking down candidates at events, parades, debates, and other things to ask questions about what they're going to do about this issue. And for anybody interested to learn more about that, you can go to our website, www.whowillfightbigmoney.org. Our staff, Izzy, Jack, and others created a terrific website that's interactive and will show you what your candidate has said, if they've signed the pledge or not, and then you can fill in your address and then be able to email or tweet to them and ask them where they stand on it.
Great. So Karen, we're going to take a second now. As I mentioned at the outset, our digital team would like you to take 30 seconds to answer a question. If you're on the phone, you can email us your thoughts at COSNET by emailing them to cosnet@commoncause.org. And that first question is, in 2016, which of the following goals are you most interested in working on with Common Cause? Working to stop the influence of big money in politics, making sure every voter has their voice heard on Election Day, creating enforceable and concrete ethics reforms in states, or stopping political gerrymandering. Or if we've struck out on those four, pick your own and fill in another.
Great. Right now. And we'll get that poll up shortly, but if y'all want to continue.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
No,
thought that. I
it's okay.
apologize. Technical difficulties.
And there we go.
Okay. So
The poll's up.
So Karen, I think while people are voting in that question session, we can ask the next question from someone who's already written in. Jim at Bay Springs, Mississippi asks, does Common Cause make a concerted effort to appeal to conservative voters as much as liberal ones?
We do. Because we also know that if we want to win reform that's going to be around for the long term, in our view, you need to work to across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, independents, if they're in a state legislature. We also find as we do polling on our issues, whether it's voting issues, money in politics issues, redistricting, we find broad support. 60, 70% for our issues. And it is independents, Republicans, and Democrats. So we look to do that on a wide array of issues. We have found in some places things have become very polarized, in particular Congress, so it's become more difficult. But when we're working at the state level, on voting reforms like online voter registration or automatic voter registration, we have gotten bipartisan support. When we've worked on disclosure issues, resolutions to overturn Citizens United, public financing of campaigns, we have been able to get Republican, Independent, and Democratic support. In fact, when I worked on public financing in Connecticut, we had a Democratic legislature and a Republican governor. And the Republican governor did a lot of work both to move the reform forward and also to help us implement it and protect it along the way. We had support in the House and the Senate with Republican and Democratic support when we moved to pass that. And when we also moved to pass fixes to adjust the law based on some of the decisions we saw come out of some of the courts, the Republicans were right there with us. We also see Democrats and Republicans support redistricting reform. It's interesting, in a state that is controlled by Democrats, you'll often see Republicans leading the way on redistricting reform. Even in places like North Carolina, where we saw the Republicans gerrymander districts after the 2010 census in such rigid and really power-grabbing ways, we now find that Republicans are willing to work on redistricting reform, in part because they see the demographic shifts in North Carolina, and they want to make sure that what they did to Democrats won't happen to them after 2020. And so we really do work to ensure that we are working across the aisle when possible, not possible on every issue or at every time, but that is a core mission of what Common Cause does.
Great, thank you, Karen. We have a next question from Jim in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, Jim is asking, what is the plan for the 2016 election?
Great question, Jim. Thank you. So one, I mentioned our Fight Big Money agenda and trying to get congressional candidates on the record. We've also seen a number of our state organizations try and do that for state legislative races too. So that's one thing we'll be working on. The other is during the election season, Common Cause really shifts into high gear around election protection work. What we do, and actually we'll show a slide of some pictures of people doing election protection, but we do election protection in 20 to 25 states each year, where we focus on presidential battleground states, races where there is highly competitive gubernatorial or Senate races, and also places where there is a real track record of voter suppression. So what we do is we work with a national coalition that has, the hotline where attorneys, and we recruit attorneys to answer questions that voters have, the 1-866-OUR VOTE line, 888 via VOTA line, and 888 API vote line. But we recruit poll monitors and poll workers that are on the ground working to ensure that voters know their rights. And also, if there are any kinds of problems, working with election officials to correct them as they happen. If that doesn't work, connecting with, it could be the Secretary of State in the state to help correct the problem that has cropped up. Sometimes it's to work with the attorneys on the hotlines. And in some cases, it's about engaging the Department of Justice if there are severe or real problems. And that work it can be a range of problems. There can be deceptive practices that crop up. For instance, a couple of years ago, there were billboards that showed up in Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio, that were in African American neighborhoods that said, in-person voting fraud is punishable as a felony, 5 years prison, and this, a fine of this much, only showing up in these African American neighborhoods. So we worked to push Clear Channel to take these down and disclose who's paying for these ads. They allowed us to put up our own billboards, and when we continued to press for disclosure, the billboards came down. But it can also be voters are purged from the list. They're told that they need to vote a provisional ballot when that's not true. They're told they need ID, voter ID, when they don't. And so we help to problem solve in states, working with our activists and also attorneys to correct the problems as they happen.
Great, thanks, Karen. Our digital team has another question. Is the technology ready this time? Okay, great. Again, they'd like to hear from you. If you're on the web, you can just reply in the box that we are assured will pop up on the screen. And if not, you can try old-fashioned email at cosnet@commoncause.org. This time the question they've prepared is, we need your participation in the 2016 campaigns to win. Which of the following will you do? Volunteer on our election team, help us get your congressional Senate. Oh, I'm sorry. I may have an old version here, don't I?
I will poll right now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. This poll is the same in this, yes? Is this the one they're asking?
That's the one.
Oh, okay. Second part is help us get your congressional and Senate candidates to tell us their opinions about money and politics. The third is work on important state campaigns and ballot measures. And the fourth is volunteer in your Common Cause state office. So again, we have another category if we have not listed your favorite choice in the first four.
Great.
Karen, why don't you tell us a little bit about the ways in which people can involve themselves in election protection work, because it ranges from sort of poll watchers to legal help.
That's right. So one, if you are interested in helping, you can go to www.commoncause.org/EP for election protection. You will start to see us sending out emails. So we hope you join our email list in many of the states where we're going to be working to recruit poll workers, and part of that is to recruit people to attend local poll worker trainings that are done by the local jurisdictions. So it may be that you do that training and you will be placed to work inside the polls, which is terrific. We also recruit poll monitors who are outside the polls and will talk to voters about any problems they experience or problems they have before they go in. So we're trying to both be testing what kind of problems there are moving forward. We also have at the national level, but also in sites around the country, in Denver, Colorado, in Los Angeles, in New York City, and others, we will set up hotlines and be part of the broader election protection network through the 1-866 Our Vote. And if you are an attorney or someone that's experienced and want to get training in some of the problems that can crop up, then you answer phone calls from voters who may need help. So those are some of the ways that you can help drive this work. The other thing is we will be fundraising around the need to, a $5,000 contribution, or if we amass small contributions that add up to $5,000, allows us to do a number of trainings and recruit a number of poll monitors. So those are a few ways that you can help.
Great. And we have one more question coming now. This one from Phil in Washington, D.C. is asking, how can I assist Common Cause in demanding that Congress restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act?
That's a great question. So, and it's perfectly timed. So some of you may know that this Saturday is the 3rd anniversary of the Supreme Court decision and the Shelby decision that struck down key components of the Voting Rights Act. So over the course of the next week, we are going to be encouraging everyone to contact their member of Congress to demand that the House and Senate restore the Voting Rights Act before the November election. And we are also calling on the chairs of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee to hold hearings on this issue to review the evidence of racial discrimination. We have been pushing for this. They have been resistant. There is no excuse not to hold these hearings. And one of the other challenges that we are seeing is in this election, there are going to be 17 states where restrictive laws have been passed, and voters are going to be facing those restrictive laws for the first time. So we fight back using litigation, advocacy, and grassroots pressure. And in places where photo ID is in place, we are working to try and ensure as many voters as possible can get the ID they need so that they can vote. But one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is, especially after 2010, we saw just a flood of bills being introduced in state legislatures around the country that had all kinds of restrictive measures, whether it was getting rid of early voting, rolling back same-day voter registration, having proof of citizenship or photo ID laws, or even reducing the number of polling places. There was a flood of those kinds of bills. And I feel like we're at this turning point where we are starting to see more proactive reforms being introduced than restrictive measures. So, for example, this year, and this is a statistic brought to us by the Brennan Center, 400 proactive reforms were introduced in 41 states. And by contrast, there were only 71, still a lot, but 71 restrictive measures in 28 states. And as we have been focused on proactive reforms, where we can move them, they have taken off in a way we didn't imagine. So, for example, I can remember sitting down with staff 2 or 3 years ago, and we talked about trying to move automatic voter registration, and we thought we were setting a bold and audacious goal to try and move automatic voter registration that shifts the burden of registration onto the government to use DMV lists and other lists to automatically register voters. And then they have the option to say, I don't want to be a voter. But when you do that, you bring far more people onto the rolls. So we talked about moving that in 5 states by 2020. And the remarkable thing is Common Cause led the fight in Oregon, which was the first state to pass automatic registration a couple of years ago. Since then, we played a leadership role in passing it in California. It's passed in Vermont, West Virginia. Connecticut just passed it using the Secretary of State used an administrative procedure working with administrative rules, working with the DMV to move it in Connecticut. And then our state chapter, working with advocates and allies, got automatic voter registration passed in the House and Senate, and we are fighting to keep the governor from vetoing it. And so that fight is going on as we know it. So we've already exceeded our goal that we set for 2020. We find that once these things pass, people get very excited by the prospect of doing this. And the other great thing is that we've seen bipartisan support for these reforms, which we believe is really important. So we've now set our goals much higher, and we have a number of states, probably more than a dozen, that have automatic voter registration bills that have been moving, and they hope to move them and get over the goal line next year. We've also passed online voter registration over the last few years, and that is passed and is either in place or ready to be in place in 38 states, which is amazing. And again, broad bipartisan support for that. And then we also work on same-day voter registration, and that is passed in 15 states. And many of the most recent victories were ones led by Common Cause.
Great. Karen, the next question is coming from Daniel in New York, New York. Daniel asks, I am skeptical that the language exists for a constitutional amendment on money in politics that is strong enough to address the problem, but not so strong as to pose a potential threat to core political free speech. Is it wise to support an amendment in the absence of specific language that satisfies these concerns, especially when robust political campaign financing may resolve a lot of our money in politics problems?
You know, it's a good question, and one we've grappled with. So we have, for example, 2 years ago, we worked with a broad coalition on coming to agreement around very careful language for the Democracy for All Amendment, which was, an amendment that we moved through the Senate to overturn Citizens United. And we worked very carefully for months to craft language that we believe does not pose a threat to political speech. And that bill received 55 votes in the Senate 2 years ago. You know, and even since then, we have seen some Republicans come out and talk about a need to overturn Citizens United by constitutional amendment. Lindsey Graham has done that recently in the last few months. There are still state-led efforts where states are passing resolutions to call on Congress to overturn Citizens United. And just in the last 2 weeks, New York became a 17th state, and it's going on the ballot in Washington state. I am somebody who has worked most of my life on small donor public financing, which I believe is a remarkable system that can do many things. Bring more candidates who are not wealthy and don't have the ability to fund a run for political office, to have the resources to do that if they work hard and talk to voters about issues. It empowers small donors that their $5, $10, $15, $100 contributions can make a difference, and they feel like their voice is heard. Public financing can mean that people govern differently. People who are elected, free from special interest money, and lobbyists who want something in return for the money that they gave, can think about what their constituents want. So working with a senator in Connecticut who talks about, I listen to my constituents and what they want is juvenile justice reform or ending capital punishment in Connecticut. it is remarkable what kinds of reforms you see move through a legislature if that stranglehold of special interest money is lessened. So to me, though, one of the biggest fears of candidates running under public financing is they worry about that outside money. And so I think public financing can be very important, but that threat of the outside money is still going to be there. And it's why I think you need to do both. And it's going to take longer to get there on the constitutional amendment. But who knows? It could be, if we get the Senate to do their job, we could have a Supreme Court nominee that could reverse that very close decision that was 5-4. But the outside spending is a huge problem, and to pretend that independent spending is not corrupting is just a crime. And we also know that a lot of that outside spending isn't even independent. You know, we're seeing unbelievable coordination with candidates setting up their own super PAC, raising money for it. And so these are real problems, and we believe we need to do all of it. So contribution limits, disclosure, small donor public financing, and overturning Citizens United so that you can put common sense rules in place to limit that outside spending.
Karen, I think you might want to take a sip of water for this next question, because Ben in Ben Lamont, California is asking, what recent accomplishments can you cite for Common Cause? And I know there are many.
There are many. And actually, this was one that was submitted earlier, and so we had a chance to prepare for this. So thank you for asking it. And it is, you know, one of the most exciting things is to work for an organization that truly moves a lot of reform. And so I'm going to read a list, and this is just reforms in the last 6 months. So I'm going to read it quickly, but just to give you a sense of the scope, the different issues, different places it's happening, that creates real excitement because there are so many different ways for our activists and members to engage. So first I'll start with some federal reforms and then move on. And it's a given, many of these we lead efforts, but in almost no place do we do it by ourselves. We always work with coalition allies. So at the federal level, there was a net neutrality court decision that upheld what the FCC did on net neutrality. We also had a victory with the Lifeline FCC decision. Lifeline is a program to get telephone service as a public utility into the homes of low-income families, and this year it was expanded to include internet service because of the increasing importance for education and employment opportunity that internet provides. We had a Supreme Court decision in Evanwell, and also a win with the FCC, which ordered radio stations, cable systems, and satellite channels to post online information about purchases of political advertising on their stations. So disclosure. In California, the legislature passed a state budget that included a $1.8 million effort to modernize the state campaign finance disclosure website. They also passed, and Governor Brown signed, a bill to allow a measure on the 2016 ballot that calls for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. In Connecticut, there was a settlement around a dispute between the Democratic Party and the State Elections Enforcement Commission, where the Democratic Party was using a loophole to evade the public financing system and raise money from state contractors that are barred from giving under the clean election system there. There was also what I mentioned earlier, the Connecticut win, where the Secretary of State announced that automatic voter registration would be implemented administratively. In Delaware, the legislature passed a rescission to a call for an Article 5 convention around a balanced budget amendment. In Florida, there was a redistricting lawsuit that ended with the courts implementing maps that were drawn by Common Cause and the League of Women Voters. In Illinois, the legislature passed automatic voter registration. We're waiting to see what the governor does. In Maryland, Montgomery County, their public financing system we passed was able to get funding. The legislature also passed an election modernization bill, And we worked with the legislature to override Governor Hogan's veto of felon voting rights reenfranchisement. And we also worked on a redistricting commission working with Republican Governor Hogan. In Massachusetts, a public records reform bill passed and was signed. In Nebraska, the legislature passed redistricting reform, although it was vetoed by the governor. In New Mexico, the legislature passed a bill to require electronic filing of contribution and expenditure reports. The legislature passed a bill to allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primary elections if they're 18 in the general election. In Albuquerque, the city council voted to put a public financing fix on the ballot for 2016. In New York, Mayor de Blasio shut down the One New York secret money nonprofit after Common Cause issued complaints about it. And New York became the 17th state with the majority of legislators to call for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. In Ohio, Common Cause Ohio fought to get Governor Kasich to veto a bill that would implement a virtual poll tax for Ohioans that petitioned to keep polls open later in case of emergencies, long lines, or malfunctioning machines. In Oregon, they've been implementing their automatic voter registration, which went very successfully, bringing 50,000 new voters onto the rolls. In Pennsylvania, the online voter registration bill passed successfully. We also passed online voter registration in Rhode Island, and the legislature passed a bill to put ethics reform on the 2016 ballot. And in South Carolina, we passed a strong ethics package, and it was signed into law. So that's just some reforms and wins we've had in the last 6 months.
Not bad, 3 minutes. So we're going to go to our last of, I think it's 3 questions that our digital team is asking. And if you're online, please reply on the box on your screen. If you are on the phone, feel free to email us at cosnet@commoncause.org. This question, if you could choose just one, which of the following would you like to see Common Cause accomplish in the next 5 years? Overturn Citizens United, pass automatic voter registration nationwide, restore the Voting Rights Act, or pass nationwide public financing? And once again, if these are not your favorites, please fill in one that is.
Wonderful. I'll give you a few more seconds to fill that out.
So when I look at those, I want us to do all of them. So maybe my set goals that are a little too high, but I think all of them are important. So I'll be really interested to see what you think.
And we've got 5 years to do them.
That's right.
All right, so we will go on now to, while folks are wrapping up that a round of answering that question, we will ask another question from Kim of Red Bluff, California. And she is asking, what can I do to help Common Cause?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for asking it. So first of all, without supporters like you, we couldn't get anything that we do done. As someone who's spent some time lobbying both here in DC and in a state capital, I can probably count on my 2 hands legislators that I move through the power of persuasion in terms of talking about the ins and outs of an issue. What really moves legislators on issues of reform is citizens getting involved and pushing them. I once had heard a pollster, Mark Mellman, talk about that he can talk to candidates about an issue and show them all the statistics of why people care about it. But if 3 people confront them in the grocery store, they're going to believe what the 3 people say to them and not what a pollster tells them. And so people underestimate the power of getting involved. So there are lots of ways you can get involved. One, you can vote and urge others to vote. And you share a friend kind of actions on Facebook, on Twitter, and others to engage people and encourage them to vote. You can volunteer for our election protection campaign. You could get involved in our Fight Big Money campaign. The truth is, we have many campaigns that are happening that I haven't even talked about here. So for example, we have a half a dozen jurisdictions that are looking to move public financing on the ballot. Howard County, Maryland, Denver, in Berkeley, California. There is a measure in California that we're hoping will move forward that will remove the ban on moving public financing forward. In Chicago, they're working on public financing. In Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Santa Fe. So there are efforts going on all over the country, and if you want to get involved in some of those campaigns, if you contact us, we can link you up with our volunteer leaders or our state staff who work on those. We also have many digital actions. So if you sign up to get to our CauseNet list to get our emails, we will connect you to campaigns that are happening in your state, that are happening at the federal level, and that will be happening moving forward. We expect another Senate rules fight come January around the filibuster, and so we will be engaging lots of people in that campaign as we get closer to the end of the year. So, you know, thinking about that. And then finally, your financial support is extremely powerful. We're made up of small donors who give $5, $10, $15, $20 at a time. And one of the best ways to support us is to do an automatic monthly gift. So you could go to www.commoncause.com/monthly to enroll to do that. And we appreciate any support that you can give us for this work. One interesting thing about Common Cause is we have about 66,000 donors, and most of those give under $1,000. So we really are made up of, we have 849 donors over $1,000. So the bulk of our money comes from our members. About 70% of our money comes from activists like you. So any support you can give would be really appreciated. So I guess, you know, lastly, I'd say I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. It's really a pleasure getting your questions and speaking to members and donors. We don't have time to answer everybody's questions, but if you have things that you want to talk to us about, talk to me about, I invite your questions, ideas, and comments. You can send them directly to me at president@commoncause.org, and I'm happy to answer those. To me, I think there is no time more critical than now, where Common Cause is never more needed. And we can't do this work without your support and your engagement. So if you have ideas, if you know of problems that you think we should be looking at, I really welcome all of those comments and ideas, because we need to be constantly looking for issues that crop up that we should be engaging in. And one of the great things about Common Cause is we are nimble. And so we may work on an issue like a call for an Article 5 convention that cropped up in the 70s and 80s. It is now moving through state legislatures around the country, and we have then leapt into action because it's getting to be, all they need is 34 states to pass this, to call Article 5 convention, where you can't even, there are no rules about what the limits are that they can discuss. There are no rules about what kind of votes you need or how you select delegates. The Supreme Court, Congress, the President have no jurisdiction about what a convention could do. They could completely rewrite our Constitution. So 28 states have passed that, and so we have re-engaged in that fight because the threat is real and we can make a difference. So anyway, thank you for joining us. Let us know if you have any questions, and we appreciate your support.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Good night.